The September sun cast long shadows across the parade grounds of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. America's largest military installation sprawled across 163,000 acres of pine forest and sandy soil, home to the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, the 82nd Airborne, and the legendary Delta Force. For more than 80 years, these grounds had forged America's elite warriors, men who had parachuted into Nazi-occupied France, fought in the jungles, and led night raids in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Alexis Reed stood motionless at the edge of the training compound, watching the Black Dagger unit run through their close-quarters battle drills. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came not from ego, but from absolute certainty in her capabilities. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform pressed to perfection. Nothing about her appearance suggesting anything beyond textbook military professionalism. 5'8" athletic, but not imposing, she had a face that blended into crowds, precisely the kind of anonymity that had served her well in her previous assignments. 3 weeks had passed since her transfer to Fort Bragg, 3 weeks of careful observation, meticulous note-taking, and maintaining the precise low profile that her personnel file suggested was appropriate for an intelligence officer with her background, West Point graduate, 2 tours in Afghanistan, specialized training in tactical analysis. The official record was impeccable, thorough, and entirely misleading. Lieutenant Reed, the voice cut across the training ground like a rifle shot. I believe you're scheduled for the CQB assessment at 0800. Colonel James Blackwood approached with the deliberate stride of a man accustomed to command. At 58, Blackwood was the embodiment of old-school military bearing, 6'2" broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair trimmed to within a quarter inch of his scalp. His face was weathered by decades of desert sun, a roadmap of fine lines radiating from eyes that had seen combat across 3 decades. The Silver Eagle insignia of full colonel gleamed on his uniform alongside the campaign ribbons from Desert Storm in Afghanistan. Yes, Colonel, Reed replied, her voice even. I was observing the current drill sequence before joining. Observing. Blackwood's tone made the word sound like an accusation. 3 weeks at my facility, Lieutenant, and you've done a lot of observing. I'm curious to see if your skills match your attention span. A small crowd of operators had gathered nearby, drawn by the colonel's tone. Reed recognized the subtle exchange of glances, the barely suppressed smirks. The Black Dagger unit was Blackwood's personal project, an elite cadre he'd shaped in his own image. Tough, disciplined, and exclusively male. With respect, sir, I believe my record speaks for itself. Reed's words carried just enough deference to avoid insubordination, but her eyes never wavered from Blackwood's. Records. Blackwood's mouth tightened into a thin line. I've seen plenty of impressive records, Lieutenant. Paper achievements don't mean much when rounds are flying downrange. The men around them shifted, sensing the tension. For 3 weeks, they had watched this standoff, building the decorated colonel who'd lost his only son in Syria 4 years ago, and the quiet female lieutenant whose transfer papers bore the signature of someone high up the chain of command. Too high for Blackwood to block. Fall in with Alpha Team, Blackwood ordered, gesturing toward the mock-up structure where the unit had been practicing hostage rescue scenarios. Let's see what you can contribute besides observations. The training facility was a marvel of military engineering, a multi-room concrete structure designed to simulate an embassy building. Inside, pop-up targets, strobing lights, and sound effects created the controlled chaos of a hostage situation. 3 hostages, represented by specialized dummies, were positioned throughout, along with a dozen hostile targets. The objective was simple: clear the building, neutralize the threats, secure the hostages. The execution was anything but. Reed took her position with Alpha Team, accepting the training rifle and sidearm, with the practiced movements of someone who had handled weapons her entire adult life. 4 operators. Staff Sergeant Miller, Corporals Jenkins and Rodriguez, and Specialist Thompson made minimal eye contact as the colonel approached. Scenario is as follows. Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the staging area. Terrorist cell has seized the American consulate in Beirut. Intelligence confirms 3 hostages, 2 diplomats, and 1 security officer. Hostiles are believed to be former special forces with advanced tactical training. Reed processed the scenario, already mapping the likely position, sight lines, and risk factors. Standard 4-man entry protocol. Blackwood continued, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Reed. Miller has led Jenkins on rear security, Rodriguez and Thompson on the flanks. Sir, Reed spoke up, her voice clear in the momentary silence. Given the layout and the profile of the hostiles, I would recommend a modified diamond formation. If these are former special forces, they'll anticipate the standard protocol. The air went still. Challenging the colonel's tactical assessment in front of his men was not something that happened at Fort Bragg, at least not by a lieutenant who had been on base for less than a month. Blackwood turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. You would recommend, Lieutenant, based on what experience exactly? Based on the fact that standard protocols were leaked during the Kabul embassy incident in 20, Reed replied without hesitation. Former Special Forces operators would know our playbook. They'd set up interlocking fields of fire to catch a standard diamond entry. A modified approach with point man moving offset by 3 feet would disrupt their preparation. The operators exchanged glances. Reed's assessment was tactically sound, but the real shock was that she had brought up the Kabul incident, a classified operation that had gone wrong when hostiles seemed to anticipate every move of the rescue team. 3 Delta operators had died. The after-action report had been classified at the highest levels. The Kabul incident, Blackwood repeated slowly, stepping closer to Reed. And how exactly would you be familiar with the details of a classified operation, Lieutenant? I read the after-action analysis during my tactical training at Fort Benning, sir. Her eyes never wavered. Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, the tension building like a thunderstorm. Very well, Lieutenant. Since you're so well-versed in tactical modifications, you take point. Miller, shift to rear security. Let's see if Lieutenant Reed's expertise extends beyond reading reports. Reed nodded once, moving into position as the team reconfigured. She checked her weapon with brisk efficiency, her mind already running through the scenario parameters. This wasn't the first time a commanding officer had tried to put her in her place by throwing her into the fire. It likely wouldn't be the last. One final modification, Blackwood announced, his voice laced with challenge. This will be a live simulation. The opposition force will be using simunition rounds. They sting, Lieutenant. Try not to get shot too many times. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward the observation post. Rodriguez leaned closer. He stacked the deck, ma'am. Opposition forces Bravo team, they've run this scenario a dozen times. Reed checked the seal on her protective mask. Thanks for the heads up, Corporal. She racked the charging handle on her rifle with a crisp, confident motion. Let's give them something they haven't seen before. The simulation began with the distinctive crack of a flashbang grenade. Reed led the team through the entry point with the modified approach she had suggested, offset by 3 feet from standard protocol. Within seconds, they encountered the first opposition. 2 operators positioned exactly where they would have had clear shots at a team using standard entry procedures. Reed moved with a fluidity that seemed almost prescient, neutralizing the first hostile before he could adjust his aim to her unexpected position. The second operator managed to fire, but Reed was already moving, dropping to one knee as she returned to fire the training round, striking center mass. Clear forward, she called, voice calm, despite the adrenaline surge. The team moved through the first section with precision, Reed's modifications to the standard protocol paying dividends with each room cleared. When they reached the central chamber, typically the most challenging part of the scenario, Reed held up a closed fist, signaling the team to hold position. Thompson, she whispered, thermal scan. The specialist produced a compact thermal imaging device scanning the walls of the chamber ahead. 3 heat signatures behind the east wall, ma'am. Probably the hostages. 4 more moving in the adjacent room. Reed nodded, then made a series of hand signals that weren't part of standard protocol. The team looked confused. Trust me, she said simply. Instead of entering through the main doorway, Reed directed the team to create a breach point through the drywall beside it. The unexpected entry point caught the opposition completely off guard. Within seconds, all 4 hostile targets were neutralized, and the team had reached the hostages without taking a single hit. As they secured the room, Blackwood's voice came over the facility's intercom. Scenario complete. All hostiles neutralized. All hostages secure. There was a pause that stretched just long enough to be noticeable. Clean run. Return to staging area. The operators looked at Reed with newfound respect as they cleared their weapons and removed their protective gear. That was something else, ma'am, Miller said quietly. Those hand signals, never seen those before. Just an old trick I picked up, Reed replied, deflecting the implied question. Let's head back. Blackwood was waiting at the staging area. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. Behind him, a group of officers and NCOs had gathered, drawn by word of the unusually successful training run. Impressive performance, Lieutenant. Blackwood said, his tone suggesting the opposite of his words. Though I don't recall authorizing the breach of the structural wall. The scenario parameters specified mission success with minimal friendly casualties, sir, Reed replied. The wall was drywall over frame construction designed to be reset after training. No permanent damage to the facility. And those hand signals, Blackwood pressed, not standard Army protocol. Adaptations based on environmental factors, sir. Standard signals would have been visible to the opposition through the doorway. Blackwood stepped closer, lowering his voice. You and I both know that's not the whole story, Lieutenant. I want to know where you really learned those tactics, and I want to know now. The gathered personnel watched the confrontation with growing interest. This was more than the usual testing of a new officer. This was Blackwood deliberately challenging Reed in front of the unit. With respect, Colonel, my training record is available in my personnel file, Reed replied, maintaining perfect military bearing despite Blackwood's proximity. Your file, Blackwood's voice dripped with contempt. Your file says you're an intelligence officer with tactical analysis experience. What I just saw wasn't analysis. That was muscle memory from years of direct action operations. Reed remained silent, her face betraying nothing. Who are you really, Lieutenant? Blackwood demanded, his voice rising. And who pulled strings to place you in my unit? The silence stretched tension building like a fault line about to rupture. Reed's eyes never left Blackwood's, her breathing calm and controlled. Sir, she finally said, I am exactly who my file says I am. If you have concerns about my placement, I suggest you take them up through the appropriate channels. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. In 25 years of command, he had never been so directly challenged by a junior officer. Something in him snapped, a combination of professional frustration and the private grief he'd carried since receiving the flag-draped coffin containing what remained of his son after a mission gone wrong in Syria. What happened next occurred so quickly that many observers would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Blackwood's hand shot forward, grabbing Reed by her hair at the base of her regulation bun. With a sharp downward yank, he pulled her face close to his. I don't know what game you're playing, he hissed, but this is my unit, and you will show proper respect, or... He never finished the sentence. Reed moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible given her position. Her left hand came up, fingers finding precise pressure points on Blackwood's wrist. Her right foot pivoted slightly, shifting her center of gravity. Her hip rotated, creating leverage where none should have existed. In less than 2 seconds, Blackwood, a man with 30 years of combat experience, found himself flat on his back, his arm locked in a joint manipulation that sent waves of pain shooting through his nervous system. Reed had executed the takedown with such precision that she hadn't even broken her perfect posture. The entire base seemed to freeze. Dozens of hardened soldiers stared in disbelief at the sight of their commander, a decorated colonel and former Special Forces operative, completely neutralized by a female lieutenant, half his age, using a technique none of them recognized. Reed released Blackwood, immediately stepping back and resuming her position of attention. Her voice, when it came, carried across the silent parade ground with crystal clarity. Respect isn't taken by force, Colonel. It's earned. The words hung in the air like the aftermath of a thunderclap. No one moved. No one spoke. Every person present knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary and potentially career-ending for both officers involved. Blackwood rose slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, rage, humiliation, and something else. A grudging, almost unwilling respect. Before he could respond, a new voice cut through the silence. Colonel Blackwood, Lieutenant Reed, my office, now. The assembled personnel parted as General Robert Sullivan strode through their midst. At 67, Sullivan was a living legend in the special operations community, a man whose career had spanned from the shadowy operations of the Cold War to the birth of modern counterterrorism. His silver hair and weathered face spoke of decades of service, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. Piercing blue eyes that had seen the darkest corners of human conflict and emerged with their clarity intact. As Reed and Blackwood followed Sullivan toward headquarters, whispers erupted across the parade ground. What they had witnessed would soon spread throughout the base, growing with each retelling. But even the most exaggerated version would miss the most significant detail, one noticed only by those with the most specialized training. The technique Reed had used wasn't taught in any U.S. military program. It was Systema, a Russian martial art developed for Spetsnaz operatives and refined by the KGB's most elite units during the Cold War. A fighting system so classified that most American intelligence officers weren't even aware of its existence. Yet Lieutenant Alexis Reed had executed it flawlessly, with the muscle memory that comes only from years of intensive training. General Sullivan's office was a testament to 4 decades of military service. Campaign maps from Desert Storm hung alongside more recent operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Photographs showed a younger Sullivan with presidents and prime ministers, generals, and diplomats. In one corner behind bulletproof glass rested artifacts from Cold War operations, too classified to be acknowledged even decades later. Sullivan closed the door and moved behind his desk with the measured pace of a man who had learned that true authority never needed to hurry. He did not invite either officer to sit. In 45 years of service, Sullivan began, his voice deceptively soft. I have never witnessed such a profound breakdown of military discipline from 2 officers who should know better. Neither Reed nor Blackwood spoke. Both stood at rigid attention, eyes fixed forward. Colonel Blackwood, Sullivan continued, you physically assaulted a junior officer in front of the entire base, under any circumstances that would warrant immediate disciplinary action. Blackwood swallowed, but maintained his position of attention. Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions. Sullivan's gaze shifted to Reed. And you, Lieutenant, executed a takedown maneuver on a superior officer, a maneuver, I might add, that is not taught in any Army training program I'm familiar with. Sir, I acted instinctively in self-defense, Reed replied, her voice steady. Instinctively? Sullivan let the word hang in the air. Curious word choice, Lieutenant. He opened a folder on his desk, glancing down at its contents. Perhaps you'd care to explain how instinct led you to execute a perfect example of the Sistema Ryabko variant, a Russian combat technique specifically designed for Spetsnaz special operations. Blackwood's eyes darted toward Reed for the first time since entering the office. Sullivan noticed the movement. Yes, Colonel, that's an excellent question, isn't it? How does an Army intelligence officer with Lieutenant Reed's official background develop muscle memory for one of the most classified foreign combat systems in existence? Sullivan closed the folder with deliberate precision. A system, I might add, that I only recognize because I encountered it firsthand during a particularly unpleasant week in East Berlin in 1985. The tension in the room shifted. This was no longer simply about a disciplinary incident. This had entered the rarefied atmosphere of national security implications. Sir, Reed began, my training record. Sullivan held up a hand, silencing her. Your training record is a masterpiece of careful omission, Lieutenant. We both know that. He leaned forward slightly. What neither you nor Colonel Blackwood knows is that this confrontation has inadvertently compromised an operation 5 years in the making. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Send them in. The door opened and 2 men in civilian suits entered. Both carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of longtime military officers despite their lack of uniforms. This is Mr. Anderson and Mr. Williams from the Department of Defense, Sullivan said, though the deliberate lack of specific identification suggested they were anything but ordinary DoD employees. They're here because what happened today has forced us to accelerate certain timetables. Sullivan gestured for the men to take positions near the door, then turned back to Blackwood and Reed. Colonel, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. If you repeat a word of it outside this room, you'll spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth. Is that clear? Blackwood nodded stiffly. Crystal clear, sir. Sullivan's attention shifted to Reed. Something passed between them, a look of shared understanding that confused Blackwood even further. Lieutenant Reed is not in fact a conventional intelligence officer, Sullivan began. 6 years ago, she was recruited into a joint CIA-Pentagon program codenamed Project Olympus. The objective was to create a new category of operator individuals capable of adapting to any tactical situations, surviving in any environment, and completing missions conventional forces would consider impossible. Blackwood's military discipline cracked slightly, his eyebrows rising in disbelief. Olympus recruited from across all branches of service, Sullivan continued, identifying candidates with exceptional physical capabilities, psychological resilience, and cognitive processing speed. The training was comprehensive. Russian Sistema, Israeli Krav Maga, classified weapon systems, enhanced interrogation, resistance, deep cover protocols. The works. General, Blackwood interrupted, unable to contain himself. Are you telling me that the U.S. government created some kind of super soldier program? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Colonel, Sullivan replied without a hint of irony, though we prefer the term enhanced operative. Lieutenant Reed was one of only 7 candidates to complete the full program. She served on 5 deep cover operations before the program was officially terminated in 2020. Reed's expression remained carefully neutral, But Blackwood noticed a subtle tension in her jaw at the mention of the program's termination. Terminated, Sullivan continued, but not disbanded. Someone high up the chain decided that Olympus operators knew too much, had seen too much. 3 of the 7 graduates have died in the past year, all in apparent accidents or suicides that upon closer examination show disturbing similarities. Blackwood looked at Reed with new understanding. And you transferred her to my unit to, what, hide her? To protect her, Sullivan corrected, while we identify who's targeting the Olympus graduates. Fort Bragg, with its constant cycle of personnel and training operations, provided ideal cover. Your unit's reputation for rigorous standards made it the perfect place for Lieutenant Reed to blend in without drawing attention. Until I forced her hand today, Blackwood said quietly, the full implications of his actions sinking in. Yes. Sullivan's tone was neutral, but his eyes were hard. Your confrontation has effectively blown her cover. Anyone looking for signs of Olympus training now knows exactly where to find her. A heavy silence filled the room. Blackwood looked at Reed, seeing her in an entirely new light, not as an interloper in his command, but as a hunted operative with capabilities he could barely comprehend. What happens now, sir? Blackwood finally asked. Sullivan exchanged glances with the 2 men by the door. Now, Colonel, you have a choice to make. You can either be debriefed, sign some very restrictive non-disclosure agreements, and return to your unit with a formal reprimand for today's incident, or you can join our operation. Join? What operation exactly? Operation Safeguard, Sullivan replied. The off-books investigation into who's targeting Olympus graduates and why. Lieutenant Reed is our primary asset, but she needs support someone with your operational experience and command authority. Sullivan leaned forward, his voice dropping. Before you answer, you should know that this isn't a standard mission. There's no official authorization, no backup, and if you're caught, the government will deny all knowledge of your activities. Blackwood looked from Sullivan to Reed, then back to Sullivan. The implications were clear. This was the kind of operation that had ended careers and lives throughout the Cold War, the kind that existed in the gray areas between official policy and national necessity. Why me? Blackwood asked finally. After what happened today, why would you trust me with something this sensitive? Sullivan smiled, a thin, knowing smile that never reached his eyes. Because your personnel file isn't entirely forthcoming either, Colonel. Before your son's death in Syria, you were being vetted for something very similar to Olympus. Your psychological profile shows an uncompromising dedication to the truth regardless of the personal or professional cost. We need that quality now more than ever. Blackwood turned to Reed, seeing past the perfect military bearing to the complex operator beneath. And you, Lieutenant, do you want me on this operation after I... He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Reed met his gaze directly for the first time since entering Sullivan's office. What happened today doesn't matter, Colonel. The only thing that matters is completing the mission and keeping the remaining Olympus graduates alive. If General Sullivan believes you can help achieve that objective, then so do I. The simplicity of her response, devoid of ego or resentment, struck Blackwood with unexpected force. This was the essence of true professionalism, the ability to set aside personal feelings in service of the mission. I'm in, Blackwood said, making his decision. Whatever this is, I want to see it through. Sullivan nodded once. Good, Mr. Anderson will brief you on the operational parameters. He turned to Reed. Lieutenant Mr. Williams will escort you to secure communications. It's time to contact your former teammate, Jason Miller. If anyone knows who's behind this, it's him. As Reed followed Williams from the office, Sullivan looked at Blackwood with an expression that combined weariness and determination in equal measure. One more thing, Colonel. What Lieutenant Reed showed you today, that was just the beginning. The capabilities developed in Project Olympus go far beyond physical combat skills. You're about to enter a world where the lines between possible and impossible have been deliberately blurred. Blackwood straightened his shoulders, the weight of this new reality settling upon him. Understood, sir. When do we start? Sullivan glanced at his watch. We already have. The clock started the moment you put your hands on Lieutenant Reed. Whoever is hunting the Olympus graduates now knows exactly where to find her. Outside Sullivan's office, across the sprawling expanse of Fort Bragg, dozens of soldiers were still discussing what they had witnessed, the mysterious female lieutenant who had taken down Colonel Blackwood with a technique none of them recognized. The story was already spreading, growing with each retelling. And somewhere monitoring these communications with technologies beyond conventional understanding, the hunters had just received the signal they had been waiting for. The chase had begun. The sun had long since set over Fort Bragg when Lieutenant Alexis Reed entered the secure communications facility buried 2 levels beneath the Special Operations Command headquarters. The room was a testament to America's technological superiority, a windowless vault of advanced systems designed to transmit and receive the most sensitive information without leaving a trace. 6 separate security checkpoints had verified her newly issued clearance, each more rigorous than the last. Mr. Williams, a designation Reed recognized as Bureau shorthand rather than a genuine name, had escorted her through each checkpoint without speaking, his expression betraying nothing. Only when the final blast door had sealed behind them did he break his silence. The general has authorized full-spectrum protocols, he said, activating a series of systems with his security card. Ghost band transmission, quantum encryption, the works. Reed nodded, understanding the implications. This level of security wasn't standard procedure even for classified operations. This was the kind of communication setup typically reserved for direct contact with deep cover assets in hostile territory. Your former teammate, Williams continued, has gone completely dark since Olympus was officially terminated. Our last confirmed location was Odessa, Ukraine, 14 months ago. Since then, we've had only 2 unconfirmed sightings, one in Istanbul, one in Dubai. Reed removed her uniform jacket, revealing a standard-issue t-shirt beneath. The fading scars on her upper arms told stories of past missions, shrapnel wounds from Azerbaijan, a bullet graze from an operation in Yemen that didn't exist in any official record. Jason won't respond to standard contact protocols, she said, taking the seat at the communications terminal. Not if he believes Olympus graduates are being targeted. Then how do you propose to reach him? Williams asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his professional detachment. Reed's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, accessing systems that shouldn't have been available through this terminal. During Olympus training, we developed contingencies, private channels, ways to communicate if official networks were compromised. Williams watched as Reed navigated through layers of security with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity with systems far beyond her official clearance level. This was Olympus training in action. The program had given its graduates backdoor access to intelligence infrastructure that even senior agency officials didn't know existed. There, Reed said, finally, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. A cryptocurrency exchange in Malta. It's one of Jason's dead drops. He checks it every 72 hours. She typed a brief message, seemingly nonsensical combinations of numbers and letters that would appear as ordinary blockchain transactions to anyone monitoring the exchange. Only someone trained in the specific decryption method would recognize it as a message, much less decode its meaning. Position compromised. Extraction imminent. Phoenix protocol initiated. Contact through Dresden channel. Reed sent the message, then immediately began creating a separate communication pathway. Dresden channel wasn't a specific technology, it was a methodology, a way of bouncing signals through obsolete Cold War-era relay stations that most intelligence agencies had long since abandoned. The beauty of the system was its antiquity. Modern surveillance focused on cutting-edge communication methods, not technologies considered obsolete since the fall of the Berlin Wall. How long? Williams asked, checking his watch. If he's still following protocol, we'll have a response within 12 hours. Reed replied, shutting down the terminal with the same efficiency she'd shown in accessing it. But Jason was always cautious. He might wait the full 72 to verify it's not a trap. Williams nodded, his respect for the sophistication of Olympus protocols evident in his expression. The general wants you to join him and Colonel Blackwood at 0600 tomorrow. Secure briefing room, sub-level 3. I'll be there, Reed confirmed, rising from her seat. As she reached for her uniform jacket, Williams noticed something that gave him pause, a small, almost imperceptible scar at the base of her skull, partially hidden by her hairline. Neural interface, he asked quietly. Reed's hand instinctively moved to cover the scar, her eyes meeting Williams's with a warning clarity. That part of the program is still classified beyond your clearance, sir. Williams held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Of course, Lieutenant. My apologies. As they exited the communications center, neither spoke again. But Williams found himself wondering just how far Project Olympus had truly gone and what other modifications Reed might be carrying beneath her seemingly ordinary exterior. In his quarters at the other end of the base, Colonel James Blackwood sat alone with a glass of bourbon and the weight of revelation pressing down upon him. The bourbon was 18-year-old Blanton's, a gift from his son, on his last leave before deploying to Syria. Blackwood had been saving it for a special occasion. Today seemed appropriate, though not for any reason he could have anticipated. On the table before him lay a dossier marked with classification levels he hadn't known existed. Mr. Anderson had left it with him an hour ago, boss, with clear instructions: memorize, then destroy. The contents had shaken Blackwood's understanding of his own military to its core. Project Olympus had begun in 2015 as a joint CIA-Pentagon response to emerging threats that conventional forces weren't equipped to handle. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of creating specialized units for specific threats, create individual operators capable of adapting to any threat. The training methods described in the dossier bordered on science fiction, experimental neuropharmacology, to enhance learning capacity, sleep phase conditioning, to embed subconscious response patterns, physical modifications that push the boundaries of medical ethics. Jesus Christ, Blackwood muttered, taking another sip of bourbon. The faces of the 7 Olympus graduates stared up at him from the dossier: 4 men and 3 women selected from different branches of the military, their pre-Olympus records impressive, but not extraordinary. Nothing that would have predicted their selection for such an unprecedented program. Alexis Reed's file was the most extensive. West Point graduate commissioned as an intelligence officer selected for Olympus after displaying exceptional adaptive thinking during a training exercise gone wrong in Alaska. The file documented her transformation from a promising young officer into something else entirely, an operative whose capabilities extended well beyond conventional understanding of human potential. And now 3 of her fellow graduates were dead. The dossier included death certificates with official causes: a car accident in Colorado, a diving incident in Florida, an apparent suicide in Seattle. But supplemental forensic analyses told a different story. Precision entry wounds disguised as traumatic impact injuries. Toxicology reports showing substances that induce behaviors mimicking suicidal ideation. Professional hits made to look like accidents executed with a level of skill that suggested the killers had intimate knowledge of the victim's enhanced capabilities. The bourbon burned Blackwood's throat as another realization settled in his consciousness. If Olympus had created 7 such operatives, it was entirely possible that other nations had developed similar programs. The killers might very well be the products of Russia's or China's equivalent to Olympus, equally enhanced, equally lethal, but serving different masters. A knock at his door interrupted these thoughts. Blackwood quickly closed the dossier and moved it to his desk drawer. Enter. The door opened to reveal Sergeant Major Frank Harris, Blackwood's senior NCO and right hand for the past 8 years. At 47, Harris had the weathered look of a career soldier, steady, reliable, unflappable in crisis. Today, however, his expression betrayed concern. Sir, Harris began closing the door behind him. Permission to speak freely. Of course, Frank. Sit down. Blackwood gestured to the chair opposite his. Harris remained standing. The incident today with Lieutenant Reed, the entire base is talking about it. Some of the men are saying she used some kind of special forces technique from another country. Blackwood chose his words carefully. Lieutenant Reed has specialized training that wasn't included in her personnel file. That's all I can say at this point. Sir, with respect, that's not good enough. Harris's tone held the unique balance that only veteran NCOs could achieve, deferential to rank while simultaneously demanding honesty. I've got operators asking questions I can't answer. Questions about chain of command, about who Lieutenant Reed really is, about why she was placed in our unit without proper vetting. She was properly vetted, Sergeant Major, Blackwood replied firmly, just not by us. Harris absorbed this, his eyes narrowing slightly. This is bigger than a personnel issue, isn't it? Blackwood considered how much he could safely reveal even to Harris. It's a matter of national security. That's all I can say until certain clearances come through. He paused, then added, but I need you to do something for me. Something important. Name it, sir. I need complete background checks on everyone who's rotated through this unit in the past 18 months, particularly anyone with specialized communications training or intelligence backgrounds. Harris raised an eyebrow. You think we have a leak, sir? I think we can't rule it out, Blackwood replied carefully. Run the checks quietly. Use our channels, not the base's standard protocols. And Frank, sir, trust no one with this, not even the men you've served with for years. Harris's expression hardened with understanding. After 29 years in the military, he recognized the gravity in Blackwood's tone. This wasn't a routine security precaution. This was something else entirely. Understood, Colonel. I'll handle it personally. After Harris departed, Blackwood returned to the dossier, focusing on the timeline of events following Olympus's official termination. The program had been shut down suddenly with little explanation beyond budget constraints and ethical reconsideration. But the pattern of deaths among its graduates suggested a more sinister reason. Someone wanted Olympus buried, not just the program, but everyone connected to it. The question was, who had both the resources and the motivation to hunt down operators specifically trained to be untraceable? The secure briefing room on sub-level 3 resembled a concrete bunker, more than an office, windowless with reinforced walls designed to block any form of surveillance. At precisely 0600, Reed arrived to find General Sullivan and Colonel Blackwood already present, along with a digital display showing a man's face Reed immediately recognized. "Jason," she said, moving closer to the screen. The image showed a man in his mid-30s with close-cropped brown hair and the watchful eyes of someone who had spent years in hostile territory. "When was this taken?" "4 hours ago," Sullivan replied. "International arrivals terminal at Dulles Airport. He was on a flight from Istanbul that landed at 1:30 Eastern Time." Reed studied the image with a mixture of relief and concern. "He received my message and responded faster than we anticipated," Sullivan noted, "which suggests he was already en route to the U.S. when your message reached him." Blackwood, who had been studying a different set of documents, looked up. Why would he risk coming back if he knew Olympus graduates were being targeted? "Because Jason has never been one to run from a fight," Reed answered, her eyes still on the screen. "If someone's hunting us, he'd want to hunt them back." Sullivan nodded in agreement, which is precisely what makes this situation so volatile. We have a highly trained Olympus operative potentially off the reservation pursuing the same targets we're investigating, but without oversight or coordination. "Do we know where he's headed?" Blackwood asked. Sullivan pressed a button on the table console, changing the display to a map of the eastern United States. Facial recognition lost him after he rented a car at Dulles. "Given the timing and trajectory, our best assessment is that he's headed here to Fort Bragg." "To find me," Reed stated with certainty. "Most likely," Sullivan confirmed. "The question is whether he's coming as an ally or because he believes you're somehow involved in the deaths of your fellow graduates." The implications hung heavy in the air. If Miller believed Reed had betrayed Olympus, their reunion would not be a friendly one. "I need to make contact before he reaches the base," Reed said. "On neutral ground where we can speak freely." Sullivan considered this, then nodded. "There's a hunting cabin 50 miles west of here in the Huari National Forest. Officially, it's a recreation property maintained by Base Logistics. Unofficially, it's a safe house we've used for sensitive debriefings. No electronic surveillance, limited access roads." "Perfect," Reed said. "I'll need transportation, minimal equipment, in a 12-hour window without check-ins." "You'll have it," Sullivan agreed. "I assume. But you won't be going alone." He looked to Blackwood. "Colonel, you'll accompany Lieutenant Reed to make contact with Miller." Blackwood's surprise was evident. "General, with respect, if Miller is as highly trained as Reed, wouldn't my presence potentially escalate the situation? He doesn't know me, has no reason to trust me." "That's precisely why you're going," Sullivan replied. "You represent the conventional military, the system Miller may believe has betrayed him. If he sees that someone of your rank and background is involved in this investigation, it might help establish that we're operating in good faith." Reed nodded in agreement. "The general's right. Jason respects the chain of command, even if he doesn't always trust it. Having a senior officer acknowledge the threat will carry weight." Blackwood absorbed this, recognizing the strategic logic even as he questioned the tactical wisdom of placing himself between two Olympus operators with capabilities he was only beginning to understand. "There's something else," Sullivan added, his expression growing more grave. "While you're establishing contact with Miller, we need to accelerate our investigation into who's targeting Olympus graduates. We have a potential lead, a financial trail connecting the last 3 deaths." He pressed another button on the console, bringing up a complex web of transactions flowing through offshore accounts, shell corporations, and cryptocurrency exchanges. "Our financial intelligence unit identified a pattern of payments preceding each death. Substantial sums moved through channels typically associated with mercenary operations and private military contractors. The most recent transaction was 3 days ago, $5 million transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands." "Someone's putting out contracts," Blackwood said, studying the display. "Professional hits disguised as accidents." "Exactly," Sullivan confirmed. "But the concerning part isn't just the money, it's where it originated." He zoomed in on one section of the financial web, highlighting a series of transactions that all traced back to a single corporate entity. Helios Strategic Solutions, a defense contractor specializing in next-generation weapon systems. Reed's expression hardened. Helios was one of the primary technology partners for Project Olympus. They developed half the specialized equipment we used, which means they know exactly what you're capable of, Blackwood concluded, and exactly how to counter those capabilities. Sullivan nodded grimly. We need to determine who at Helios is behind this and why they're targeting Olympus graduates. But we have to proceed with extreme caution. Helios has contracts with every branch of the military, close ties to the intelligence community, and board members who served at the highest levels of government, including former Secretary of Defense William Harrington, Reed added. He was one of the original architects of Project Olympus. The implications were chilling. If someone with Harrington's connections and clearance levels was involved, the conspiracy could reach into the highest echelons of power. While you're making contact with Miller, Sullivan said, I'll be meeting with trusted contacts in Washington, people who can help us access Helios's secured records without triggering alarms. With luck, by the time you return with Miller, we'll have a clearer picture of what we're facing. Blackwood studied Reed's expression, noting the careful control with which he processed this information. You don't seem surprised that Helios might be behind this, he observed. I'm not, Reed admitted. When Olympus was terminated, several of us suspected it wasn't really about ethics or budget constraints. The program had achieved breakthroughs that went beyond military applications, enhancements that had commercial potential worth billions in the private sector. You think Helios wants to commercialize the technology that created you? Blackwood asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. Not all of it, Reed replied. Just the parts that can be packaged and sold to the highest bidder. Neural interfaces, accelerated learning protocols, physical enhancement procedures. The global market for human performance enhancement is projected to reach trillion-dollar levels within a decade. Sullivan nodded in agreement. And the Olympus graduates represent both the proof that these technologies work and the most significant security risk to their commercial exploitation. Because we know how they were developed, Reed added quietly, and what they cost in human terms. The weight of her statement hung in the air, prompting a question Blackwood had been reluctant to ask since reading the dossier. How many candidates didn't survive the Olympus training? Reed met his gaze directly, her eyes revealing more than her carefully controlled expression. We started with 36, 7 graduated. The silence that followed contained more truth than any official record ever would. 29 lives lost in the pursuit of creating the perfect operative casualties in a war most Americans didn't know was being fought using methods that would never be acknowledged. Gear up, Sullivan said, finally breaking the silence. You leave for the safe house in 30 minutes. If Miller is moving as quickly as we suspect, he'll reach the area by nightfall. As Reed and Blackwood rose to depart, Sullivan added one final warning. Remember, if Helios is indeed behind this, they have resources that rival our own. Assume all standard channels are compromised. Once you leave this facility, you're on your own until you return. The Huari National Forest stretched across 50,000 acres of North Carolina wilderness, rolling hills covered in pine and hardwood cut through by clear streams and rocky outcroppings. In autumn, the changing foliage created a tapestry of red and gold against the evergreen backdrop. But beauty wasn't what had drawn military planners to establish a safe house deep within its boundaries. It was isolation. The hunting cabin sat in a small clearing, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through 5 miles of dense forest. Built to resemble a typical sportsman's retreat, it concealed sophisticated security systems and structural reinforcements that could withstand most conventional attacks. The nearest civilian residence was over 12 miles away. Reed and Blackwood arrived as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees. They had traveled separately, Reed on a motorcycle that allowed her to monitor the winding forest roads for signs of surveillance, Blackwood in an unmarked SUV carrying supplies and communications equipment. Both had changed from military uniforms to civilian clothing that would attract minimal attention if seen by hunters or hikers. Perimeter looks clear, Reed reported as they unloaded gear from Blackwood's vehicle. No signs of electronic surveillance or human presence within the last 24 hours. Blackwood nodded, impressed despite himself at Reed's situational awareness. She had spotted details he would have missed despite his years of field experience. Subtle indicators like the undisturbed pattern of fallen leaves on the approach road and the behavior of local wildlife that suggested no recent human activity. Inside, the cabin maintained its rustic appearance, rough-hewn furniture, a stone fireplace mounted deer heads on the walls, But beneath this facade lay military-grade technology. Reed went directly to a specific floorboard, lifting it to reveal a biometric scanner. She placed her palm on the device, which glowed briefly before a soft click indicated acceptance. A section of wall beside the fireplace silently receded, revealing a hidden room equipped with communications gear, weapons, and medical supplies. Standard safe house protocol, Reed explained, noting Blackwood's expression. All Olympus operators were given access to these facilities as part of our contingency planning. Blackwood surveyed the hidden room with newfound respect for the thoroughness of Olympus preparations. How many of these facilities exist? 23 within U.S. borders, Reed replied, checking the weapons cache. Another 14 internationally. Most military personnel with top secret clearance know about perhaps 5 or 6. And who authorized their creation? Blackwood asked, the implications troubling him. Who funded them? Reed selected a compact 9mm sidearm from the weapons rack, checking its action with practiced efficiency. That's the kind of question that got Olympus shut down, Colonel. She holstered the weapon at the small of her back, concealed beneath her jacket. Some programs exist in the spaces between official oversight places where deniability is more valuable than accountability. The statement hung in the air, a stark reminder of the shadow world they had entered, one where conventional military chain of command and congressional oversight became flexible concepts rather than rigid requirements. How will Miller find us? Blackwood asked, changing the subject. Reed moved to the cabin's main room, beginning the process of preparing it for Miller's arrival. He won't have to. He already knows we're here. How could he possibly? Because I would know, Reed interrupted. Olympus training included extensive psychological profiling. We don't just know each other's tactical capabilities. We know how each of us thinks, how we approach problems, where we'd go if compromised. She gestured toward the forest outside. Jason's out there right now watching this cabin. Has been since before we arrived. He's confirming it's not a trap, identifying potential escape routes, assessing our numbers and capabilities. Blackwood instinctively glanced toward the window, seeing nothing but darkening forest beyond. You won't spot him, Reed said with certainty. Not until he wants to be seen. As if on cue, the satellite phone on the cabin's table buzzed once. Reed picked it up, checking the message that had appeared on its screen. Verify Anchorage Protocol, November 2018. Reed typed a response without hesitation. Frozen Lake, White Raven, Broken Mirror. She set the phone down. He'll come in now. Less than 2 minutes later, a soft knock came at the cabin's door. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Reed moved to answer it, signaling for Blackwood to remain visible but non-threatening. When she opened the door, Jason Miller stood on the threshold, 6 feet of coiled tension in civilian hiking gear that did nothing to disguise his military bearing. His face was leaner than in the airport surveillance photo, with a new scar along his left jawline. His eyes moved quickly, cataloging every detail of the cabin's interior before settling on Blackwood with unmistakable suspicion. Colonel James Blackwood, Miller said, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone processing tactical information. Commander Black Dagger Special Training Unit, Bronze Star with Valor, Afghanistan 2011, Son killed in action, Syria 2019. The detailed knowledge of his background caught Blackwood off guard. You've done your homework, Mr. Miller. Jason, Reed intervened. The colonel is here as an ally. He knows about Olympus, about what's happening to the graduates. Miller's attention shifted to Reed, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. 4 down now, Alexis. Coleman died yesterday in Vancouver. Same pattern as the others, made to look like an accident, but too precise, too perfect. The news hit Reed visibly, a slight tightening around her eyes, the only outward sign of grief. That leaves just the 3 of us. Which is why I need to know, Miller said, stepping fully into the cabin, but leaving the door open behind him, a clear escape route. Why are you working with conventional military when you know we've been burned? When you know they shut us down and are now cleaning house? Because it's not the military targeting us, Reed replied. At least not officially. We've traced financial transactions linking all 4 deaths to Helios Strategic. Miller's reaction was immediate, a subtle shift in posture that Blackwood recognized as combat readiness. Kirkpatrick's company, I should have known. Dr. Edward Kirkpatrick, Blackwood asked, recognizing the name from the Olympus dossier. The lead scientist. Miller nodded grimly. Kirkpatrick was the architect of the enhancement protocols. The neural interfaces, the physiological modifications, everything that made Olympus operators different from conventional special forces. But why would he target his own creations? Blackwood pressed. What could he possibly gain by eliminating the very proof that his work succeeded? Freedom to commercialize without witnesses, Reed answered. The modifications made to Olympus operators weren't just about making us more effective in the field. They were prototype applications for technologies Kirkpatrick planned to market globally first to military and intelligence agencies, then to private security firms, eventually to civilian medical applications. Some of what was done to us violated every ethical standard in modern medicine, Miller added. International laws, the Geneva Convention, basic human rights. Kirkpatrick can't take his technology public with living evidence of how it was developed. Blackwood absorbed this, the full horror of the situation had becoming clear. So he's eliminating witnesses while preparing to introduce refined versions of the same technology. Versions without the ethical baggage. Exactly, Reed confirmed. And with his connections in government and the private sector, he can ensure that any investigation into Olympus remains classified indefinitely. Miller moved further into the cabin, finally closing the door behind him. General Sullivan sent you, didn't he? He's the only one with both the clearance to know about Olympus and the moral compass to oppose what's happening. He did, Reed acknowledged. He's been gathering evidence on Helios for months, trying to build a case solid enough to take to the Director of National Intelligence. It won't be enough, Miller said flatly. Not against someone with Kirkpatrick's connections. The only way to stop him is to expose exactly what Olympus was, what was done to us in the name of national security. The declaration hung in the air, its implications clear. Exposing Olympus would mean violating multiple national security oaths, risking imprisonment, possibly even being labeled traitors. It would mean revealing classified programs that the government had spent billions to keep secret. If you're thinking about whistleblowing, Blackwood said carefully, I should remind you both of the potential consequences, not just legally, but to national security. Miller's gaze hardened. With respect, Colonel, I've given more for national security than most could comprehend. We all have. He gestured toward Reed. Ask Alexis about Tehran. Ask her what we did there in the name of American interests. Ask her what it cost. Reed's expression remained carefully neutral, but Blackwood noticed her hand move unconsciously toward her left side, where he recalled from the dossier she had sustained a severe injury during an operation in Iran. Tehran was a sanctioned mission, she said quietly. What Kirkpatrick is doing isn't. He's privatizing technology developed with taxpayer money, eliminating witnesses to its development, and preparing to sell it to whoever can pay, including potentially foreign governments. The distinction was crucial, a line between classified operations serving national interests and private corruption threatening those same interests. It shifted the moral calculus of their potential actions. Before Blackwood could respond, a subtle vibration emanated from equipment in the hidden room. Reed moved immediately to investigate, returning moments later with a handheld scanner. We have movement on the perimeter, she reported, multiple heat signatures approaching from the northeast. Professional spacing and movement patterns. Miller was already moving, checking sight lines through the cabin's windows. How many? At least 6, possibly more further back, Reed replied, her voice calm despite the implication. Tactical formation consistent with private military contractors, not standard military or law enforcement. Blackwood's training kicked in immediately. How were we tracked? The vehicles were clean. We followed all counter-surveillance protocols. They didn't track the vehicles, Miller said, his expression grim. They tracked me. I should have anticipated it. Kirkpatrick helped develop the biomonitoring systems integrated into our Olympus enhancements. He can detect the unique electromagnetic signature our neural interfaces generate, which means he knew the moment you entered U.S.'s airspace, Reed concluded. Every move you've made since has been monitored. The realization struck with devastating clarity. They hadn't just been found, they had been allowed to gather to consolidate the remaining Olympus graduates in one location for efficient elimination. We need to move, Miller said, already gathering essential equipment. They'll have the road covered. Our best option is to head south through the forest, use the ridgeline for cover, then cut east toward the highway. Reed nodded in agreement, moving with the same focused efficiency. Colonel, the satellite phone is our secure line to General Sullivan. We need to warn him that Kirkpatrick knows we're on to him. Blackwood retrieved the phone, quickly composing a message in the encryption protocol Sullivan had established. As he worked, Reed and Miller methodically prepared for what was coming, checking weapons, gathering survival gear, plotting escape routes. The calm precision of their actions struck Blackwood forcefully. These weren't ordinary soldiers responding to a threat. They were something else, operatives whose training had rewritten the very way their minds and bodies functioned under pressure. Their movements held a synchronicity that bordered on preternatural, anticipating each other's needs without verbal communication. Message sent. Blackwood reported securing the phone in his jacket. How much time do we have? Less than 5 minutes before they reach optimal firing positions, Miller replied, checking the scanner once more. They're moving carefully. These aren't amateurs. Reed handed Blackwood a compact sidearm from the hidden cache. Former Special Forces, most likely. Helios recruits heavily from retired operators. The irony wasn't lost on Blackwood elite American soldiers trained at taxpayer expense, now employed as private contractors to eliminate American military assets. The corruption of the system was more profound than he had imagined. Stay between us, Reed instructed Blackwood as they prepared to exit through the cabin's rear door. Follow our lead move only when we move. These men will be using thermal imaging and possibly sound detection equipment. Standard tactical responses won't be effective. Blackwood nodded, accepting the reality that despite his rank and experience in this scenario, he was the least qualified person present. Understood. I'll follow your lead. Reed paused at the door, meeting his gaze directly. One more thing, Colonel. What you're about to see, what Miller and I are capable of when fully engaged, isn't in any briefing you've received. Don't hesitate, don't question, and don't try to intervene. Just stay with us. The warning sent a chill through Blackwood that had nothing to do with the autumn air now flowing through the open door. Whatever Olympus had created went beyond enhanced soldiers or specialized operatives. He was about to witness something that existed in the classified spaces between military capability and science fiction. As they slipped into the darkening forest, the first shots rang out, suppressed rifles firing from positions along the cabin's perimeter. The hunters had arrived unaware that their prey was unlike anything they had encountered before. The chase had entered its next more lethal phase. Darkness had fully claimed the Uhari forest, the dense canopy blocking even the faint illumination of stars. For conventional soldiers, the absence of light would have been a near insurmountable tactical disadvantage. For Alexis Reed and Jason Miller, it was their element. Colonel James Blackwood moved between them with careful precision, following their lead as they navigated the wilderness. His decades of military experience had taught him to move silently through difficult terrain, but what he witnessed now transcended conventional training. Reed and Miller didn't just move through the forest, they seemed to merge with it, their movements fluid and instinctual in ways that defied explanation. The mercenaries pursuing them had established a standard tactical perimeter, a horseshoe formation designed to funnel targets toward a predetermined kill zone. It was textbook Special Forces doctrine, executed with the precision that came from years of field experience. Against ordinary opponents, even highly trained military personnel, it would have been devastatingly effective. But Olympus graduates were anything but ordinary. Reed signaled a halt with a gesture so subtle Blackwood nearly missed it. Miller froze instantly. Through hand signals, Blackwood didn't recognize they communicated a complex series of observations and tactical adjustments. Then without warning, they separated, Reed moving west, Miller east, leaving Blackwood momentarily alone in the darkness. Before he could process this apparent abandonment, Reed's voice came through the compact earpiece he wore. Stay absolutely still, Colonel. Count to 100, then move directly south for 50 meters. We're creating a diversion. Blackwood complied, his military discipline overriding the instinct to question. As he counted silently, the forest erupted with activity. Half a kilometer to the west shouts automatic weapons fire, the distinctive thud of stun grenades. Moments later, similar sounds echoed from the east. The mercenaries' carefully coordinated formation dissolved as they responded to threats on multiple fronts. When Blackwood reached his count, he moved south as instructed, finding Reed waiting exactly where she had said she would be. Miller appeared 30 seconds later, materializing from the darkness like a ghost. 8 mercenaries total, Miller reported, his breathing controlled despite what must have been intense exertion. 4-man teams on each flank utilizing advanced thermal imaging and tactical communications. Former Delta and SEAL operators, Reed added, checking her weapon. Equipment suggests Helios Private Security Division. They're using prototype sound suppressors, military grade, not yet available on commercial markets. Blackwood marveled at the precision of their assessment. In the chaos and darkness, they had not only counted their opponents, but identified their training backgrounds and equipment specifications. What did you do out there? He asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Created false thermal signatures, Miller replied matter-of-factly. Old Olympus trick, using controlled exothermic chemical reactions to generate heat patterns that mimic human movement. We have approximately 6 minutes before they realize they're chasing decoys, Reed added. We need to reach the eastern ridge before they regroup. As they moved through the forest, Blackwood's respect for his companions deepened. This wasn't just superior training or advanced technology at work. This was something else, a fundamental reimagining of human capability executed with precision that bordered on the uncanny. The neural interfaces, he said, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of terrain. That's how you're doing this, isn't it? They enhance your spatial awareness, your reaction times. Reed glanced back, surprised by his insight. Partially, the interfaces sync with our central nervous systems, optimizing sensory processing and motor control. But that's just the foundation. The real advantage is in the cognitive modifications, the way our brains were retrained to process tactical information. Like parallel computing instead of linear thinking, Miller added. We don't experience combat sequentially the way conventional operators do. We process multiple threat vectors simultaneously, calculating probabilities and responses in real time. The casual way they described such profound alterations to human cognition sent a chill through Blackwood. The ethical implications were staggering, human beings fundamentally rewired by military scientists, their very consciousness restructured for optimal combat performance. And the cost? Blackwood asked quietly. What did these modifications do to you, to who you were before? A heavy silence followed his question, broken only by the sounds of their movement through the underbrush. Finally, Reed answered her voice, carrying an emotion Blackwood hadn't heard from her before. We gave up pieces of ourselves, she said. Memories, emotional responses, personal connections, neural pathways sacrificed to make room for tactical processing capacity. The program psychologist called it necessary compartmentalization. We called it something else, hollowing. Miller supplied the word, carrying a weight that suggested deep personal significance. They hollowed us out to fill us with something else. Before Blackwood could respond, Reed signaled another halt. They had reached the edge of a steep ravine, beyond which lay the eastern ridge, their best chance of breaking contact with their pursuers and reaching the highway. Problem, Miller said, scanning the darkness with a small device pulled from his pack. They've repositioned faster than anticipated. 2 operators have already reached the far side of the ravine. They're establishing overwatch positions with clear fields of fire across our most viable crossing points. Reed assessed the situation with methodical precision. Options. We could double back attempt to circle around to the north, Miller suggested. Adds 4 kilometers and at least 90 minutes to our route. Too long, Reed decided. Sullivan needs to be warned about Kirkpatrick immediately. The satellite phone's encryption will only buy us so much time before Helios detects the transmission. Then we fight through, Miller concluded. 2 operators, even former Tier 1 against 2 Olympus graduates. Favorable odds. 3, Blackwood interjected firmly. 3 against 2. I may not have your enhancements, but I've been in combat since before either of you enlisted. Reed and Miller exchanged a glance that contained a silent evaluation of Blackwood's capabilities. Finally, Reed nodded. You take the operator on the left flank. Miller and I will handle the right and center. Non-lethal if possible, these men may not know who they're really working for. The plan was simple but effective, leveraging their superior tactical awareness against the mercenaries' conventional positioning. Reed and Miller would create a diversion, drawing the attention of the Overwatch team, while Blackwood maneuvered to neutralize the left flank position. What followed was unlike any operation Blackwood had participated in during his long military career. Reed and Miller didn't just execute their roles, they seemed to anticipate every countermove before it occurred, adjusting their tactics with a synchronicity that defied conventional training. They moved like dancers, performing a lethal choreography, each step precisely calculated for maximum effect. Blackwood did his part, using the distraction to approach the left flank operator undetected. The man was good positioned with optimal visibility and multiple escape routes, his attention firmly fixed on Reed and Miller's movements across the ravine. But he was still human, still limited by conventional training and natural human capabilities. The takedown was clean and efficient, a chokehold applied with the precision that came from years of close-quarters combat training. The mercenary struggled briefly before losing consciousness, never having detected Blackwood's approach. Across the ravine, Reed and Miller had already neutralized the second operator. They regrouped at a predetermined point, moving swiftly toward the highway that represented their best chance of reaching civilization, and from there warning General Sullivan about the full extent of Kirkpatrick's operation. As they traveled, Blackwood noticed a subtle change in Reed's movement, a slight favoring of her right side that suggested injury. "You're hit," he observed quietly. "Grazed," she corrected, not slowing her pace. "Second operator got a round off before we neutralized him. Impact trauma, only the body armor stopped it." Miller glanced at her with an expression that suggested he knew more than she was acknowledging. "The interface shunt on your left side. The impact point was directly over it, wasn't it?" Reed's momentary hesitation confirmed Miller's assessment. "System still operational. Performance degradation minimal. Until the backup protocols engage," Miller countered. "You know how the fail-safes work, Alexis. If the system detects potential compromise, it'll initiate shutdown to prevent cascade failure." Blackwood looked between them, understanding dawning. "The neural interfaces, they're directly connected to your central nervous system. If Reed's is damaged, worst case localized nerve damage," Reed stated flatly. "Best case temporary loss of enhanced functions until the system stabilizes. Either way, we keep moving." The matter-of-fact way she addressed potentially serious neural damage underscored the profound differences between Olympus operators and conventional soldiers. Reed wasn't just trained to ignore pain, she was engineered to prioritize mission completion above physiological integrity. "How long until we reach the highway?" Blackwood asked, accepting Reed's assessment of her condition. 20 minutes at current pace," Miller replied. "From there, 4 kilometers to the nearest service station with phone access." Reed checked the satellite phone she carried. "Sullivan should have received our initial warning by now. Standard protocol would have him initiating countermeasures against Kirkpatrick." "Which assumes Kirkpatrick doesn't have contingencies already in place," Miller added grimly. "A man who rose to his position plans for every possibility, including discovery." The implication hung in the air between them as they continued their journey. They had identified Kirkpatrick as the architect of the conspiracy, but the true scope of his plans and his resources remained unknown. If his reach extended as far as they suspected, even Sullivan's considerable influence might not be sufficient to stop him. Dawn was breaking over Washington, D.C. when General Robert Sullivan entered the Pentagon's secure conference room, designated for the Joint Special Operations Command. The room was a testament to America's military might, state-of-the-art communication systems, multiple secure terminals, and a central table where the nation's most sensitive operations were planned and authorized. Sullivan had spent the night activating a network of trusted contacts, former operatives, intelligence officers who owed him favors, military officials whose loyalty to country transcended political considerations. The message from Blackwood had confirmed his worst fears. Kirkpatrick wasn't just eliminating Olympus graduates to cover his tracks. He was preparing to privatize the program's technologies for personal gain. The general moved with the measured precision of a man who had navigated Washington's power structures for decades. At 67, he carried the physical burden of multiple combat deployments and the psychological weight of countless classified operations. But this morning, there was renewed purpose in his movements, the focused determination of a warrior preparing for perhaps his final and most important battle. "Secure the room," he instructed the aide who had escorted him. "Authorization Sullivan Delta 7, no entry without my explicit approval." The aide, a young major with intelligence branch insignia, nodded sharply. "Yes, General. The Secretary is expecting your briefing at 0800. "The Secretary will get it when I'm ready," Sullivan replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Not before. Now secure the room." As the doors sealed behind the departing aide, Sullivan moved to the central console, entering a series of access codes that activated the room's highest security protocols. Surveillance systems disabled recording equipment, offline communications restricted to manually authorized channels. Then he removed a small device from his pocket, a secure data drive containing everything he had gathered on Project Olympus Helios Strategic Solutions and Dr. Edward Kirkpatrick. Years of careful investigation, piecing together fragments of classified information following money trails through the labyrinthine world of defense contracting. The evidence was damning. Kirkpatrick had not only orchestrated the systematic elimination of Olympus graduates, but had established a parallel research program within Helios 1 that continued the most ethically questionable aspects of Olympus while preparing to market sanitized versions of its technologies to military and intelligence agencies worldwide. Sullivan inserted the drive into the console, initiating the transfer of files to a secure server, accessible only to a select group of officials with the highest security clearances. People whose integrity he trusted implicitly: the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. As the transfer began, a subtle vibration from his secure phone alerted him to an incoming message. The device was keyed to Reed's unique communication protocols designed to bypass conventional networks. Kirkpatrick, aware of investigation, defensive measures likely initiated, proceeding to extraction point with package, ETA 90 minutes. Sullivan acknowledged the message, then returned to his preparations. Reed and Miller were alive, and with Blackwood, that much was certain. But Kirkpatrick's awareness of their investigation complicated matters significantly. A man with his resources and connections would have contingency plans for exactly this scenario. The general's suspicions were confirmed moments later when the conference room door opened, revealing a face he had hoped not to see until his preparations were complete. "Robert," said former Secretary of Defense William Harrington, stepping into the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to access at the highest levels. "I heard you were calling an emergency briefing. I thought I might save you some time." At 72, Harrington remained an imposing figure in Washington's defense establishment. Though officially retired from government service, his position on multiple corporate boards, including Helios Strategic Solutions, ensured his continued influence in military and intelligence circles. "This is a classified briefing, Bill," Sullivan replied, his expression neutral, despite the alarm bell sounding in his mind. "I don't recall seeing your name on the current access roster." Harrington smiled, a practiced expression that never reached his eyes. "Some doors remain open even after retirement, Robert, especially when matters of national security are concerned." He glanced meaningfully at the console where Sullivan's data transfer was still in progress. "Or should I say, especially when matters concerning Project Olympus are concerned." The explicit mention of the classified program confirmed Sullivan's worst fears. Harrington wasn't here by chance or curiosity. He was here to contain the situation. "How long have you known?" Sullivan asked, buying time as he assessed his options. "About your investigation." Harrington moved further into the room, the door closing automatically behind him. "Long enough. Edward keeps me well informed about potential threats to our work." "Your work," Sullivan repeated, the words laden with accusation. "Privatizing military technology developed with taxpayer funds, eliminating witnesses to its development, selling America's classified capabilities to the highest bidder." Harrington's expression hardened. "Don't be naive, Robert. Olympus was always meant to transition to the private sector. The government phase was simply proof of concept, demonstrating that the technologies worked before scaling them for broader applications." "Applications like what?" Sullivan demanded. "Private military contractors equipped with neural interfaces, corporate espionage using operatives with enhanced cognitive capabilities, or something worse, selling these technologies to foreign powers with the resources to pay Helios's asking price." "You're thinking too small," Harrington replied, his tone suggesting disappointment in Sullivan's lack of vision. "This isn't about military applications, though those are certainly lucrative. This is about the future of human performance enhancement applications that extend from the battlefield to the boardroom, from intelligence agencies to medical rehabilitation." He gestured expansively. "Imagine stroke victims regaining full neural function through interface technology. Imagine executives processing information at twice the speed of their competitors. Imagine diplomatic personnel with perfect recall of every conversation, every nuance, every subtle indicator of deception." "At what cost?" Sullivan countered. "I've seen what these technologies did to the Olympus graduates. The psychological impact, the neural degradation, the loss of identity. You're talking about commodifying technologies that fundamentally alter human consciousness. Every significant advance has costs, Robert." Harrington's voice had taken on the reasonable tone he had once used to persuade congressional committees to approve defense budgets. The early test subjects, yes, they paid a price. But their sacrifices paved the way for refined approaches, safer implementations. "Tell that to the 4 Olympus graduates Kirkpatrick has already eliminated," Sullivan replied sharply. "Were their deaths necessary refinements as well?" Harrington's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine regret crossing his features. "Unfortunate, but unavoidable. They knew too much about the early development processes, information that could derail the entire program if made public." Edward made a calculated decision. "Murder is a business strategy," Sullivan said, disgust evident in his tone. "And you approved it." "I authorized containment of a security breach," Harrington corrected. "The method was Edward's choice. I might have preferred a less permanent solution, but what's done is done." Sullivan studied the man he had once respected, a decorated veteran, a public servant with decades of service to his country. Somewhere along the way, Harrington had crossed a line rationalizing increasingly unethical actions in pursuit of what he perceived as a greater good. It ends here, Bill, Sullivan said firmly. The evidence has already been transmitted. The Secretary of Defense, the DNI, the Joint Chiefs, they'll all have complete documentation of Olympus Helios's involvement in the elimination of the graduates. Harrington sighed the sound heavy with what seemed like genuine regret. I was afraid you'd say that. He reached into his jacket, producing a small device Sullivan immediately recognized, a compact sidearm equipped with a suppressor. Which is why I came personally. Some messes require a direct approach. Sullivan stared at the weapon, then at the man holding it. You're going to assassinate a 3-star general in the Pentagon. Even for you, Bill, that's a stretch. Not assassination, Harrington corrected. According to the report that's already been prepared, you suffered a catastrophic cardiac event during a classified briefing. A tragic loss for the military community. Your history of heart problems makes it entirely credible. The casual way he outlined the cover story sent a chill through Sullivan. This wasn't an impulsive action. It was a carefully planned contingency, probably one of several Harrington had prepared for various scenarios. And the evidence I've transmitted? Sullivan asked, playing for time as he evaluated his limited options. Will be classified at the highest levels, then buried in bureaucratic review until its relevance has passed, Harrington replied confidently. By the time anyone could act on it, Helios will have already secured its international patents and established market dominance. Sullivan nodded slowly as if accepting the inevitable. Then, with the speed and precision that had once made him a legendary field operator, he moved, activating an emergency protocol on the console that instantly locked down the room and triggered a silent alarm to Pentagon security. Harrington reacted with surprising quickness for a man his age bringing the weapon to bear. But Sullivan had anticipated this, already diving for cover behind the conference table as the first shot rang out. The bullet embedded itself in the wall where Sullivan had been standing moments before. You're only delaying the inevitable, Robert, Harrington called, adjusting his position for a better angle. Security won't respond to the alarm, not with my clearance codes already in the system. Sullivan didn't respond, conserving his energy as he calculated his next move. Unarmed and facing a determined opponent with a firearm, his options were severely limited. But a lifetime in special operations had taught him that even the most disadvantageous situation contained opportunities for those trained to recognize them. The room's ventilation system activated automatically as part of the lockdown protocol, a measure designed to clear the air in case of chemical or biological agents. The sudden hum provided auditory cover as Sullivan moved beneath the conference table, positioning himself for a flanking maneuver. It doesn't have to end this way, Harrington continued, slowly advancing around the table. Edward would still welcome your expertise. There's a place for you in this new paradigm, a comfortable position, a chance to shape how these technologies are implemented. The offer, a final attempt at co-optation rather than elimination, told Sullivan everything he needed to know about Harrington's current position. The former secretary wasn't as confident as he pretended. He was still considering alternatives, still calculating probabilities. You know me better than that, Bill, Sullivan replied. His voice projected to suggest a position different from his actual location. Some lines can't be uncrossed. Principles at the expense of progress, Harrington said dismissively. That's always been your limitation, Robert. The inability to see the larger picture when it conflicts with your personal moral code. As Harrington rounded the conference table, Sullivan made his move, launching himself upward with the explosive force that had been his trademark in close-quarters combat. The attack caught Harrington mid-step, Sullivan's shoulder driving into the older man's midsection with precisely calculated force. The impact sent both men crashing into the wall, Harrington's weapon discharging once into the ceiling before clattering to the floor. Sullivan pressed his advantage, years of hand-to-hand combat training, overcoming the limitations of age as he secured Harrington in a joint lock that rendered him immobile. The larger picture, Sullivan said, is breathing controlled despite the exertion. Includes the rule of law, Bill, something you seem to have forgotten. The conference room door burst open, revealing a security team led by the intelligence branch major who had escorted Sullivan earlier. Their weapons were drawn, expressions professionally neutral as they assessed the situation. General Sullivan, sir, the major said, taking in the scene with well-trained calm. We received your alert. The Secretary of Defense has been notified and is en route. Sullivan maintained his hold on Harrington, who had ceased struggling upon the arrival of witnesses. Major placed former Secretary Harrington under military arrest. Charges include conspiracy, attempted murder of a military officer, and treason. You can't prove any of it, Harrington said quietly, his composure returning despite his compromised position. Edward has covered our tracks too well, and my influence still extends further than you realize. Sullivan released him to the custody of the security team. Perhaps, but influence has its limits when faced with irrefutable evidence. He moved to the console where the data transfer had completed. And as for proof, the Olympus graduates you failed to eliminate are currently en route with documentation even your connections can't bury. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Harrington's features. Reed and Miller impossible. Edwards' team had them surrounded in North Carolina. Had being the operative word, Sullivan replied, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction. You should have reviewed the Olympus field performance metrics more carefully, Bill. 2 graduates against a team of conventional operators, even elite ones. Those odds favor Olympus every time. As the security team escorted Harrington from the room, Sullivan turned his attention to the secure terminal. Reed's most recent message indicated they would reach the extraction point within the hour. But Kirkpatrick still remained at large, undoubtedly already implementing his own contingency plans. The battle had been joined, but it was far from over. The true test would come in the hours and days ahead, as the full scope of Project Olympus and its privatization scheme came to light. The Pentagon's secure debriefing facility resembled a high-end medical clinic more than a military installation. Advanced monitoring equipment lined the walls, medical personnel in civilian clothing moved with practiced efficiency, and the subtle hum of air purification systems created a backdrop of white noise. Lieutenant Alexis Reed sat on an examination table, her expression neutral as technicians evaluated the neural interface embedded at the base of her skull. The impact trauma from the mercenaries' round had indeed triggered the system's fail-safe protocols, temporarily limiting some of her enhanced capabilities. But the core technology remained intact, a testament to its sophisticated design and Reed's remarkable physiological resilience. In an adjacent room, Jason Miller underwent similar examination. His interface had shown signs of degradation during their escape from the Ohari Forest, subtle performance fluctuations that suggested the need for maintenance beyond what field conditions allowed. Colonel James Blackwood watched these procedures from an observation area, his mind still processing everything he had witnessed during their journey to Washington. The capabilities Reed and Miller had demonstrated went beyond anything in his considerable military experience, not just enhanced physical performance, but fundamentally altered cognitive processing, perception, and tactical awareness. General Sullivan joined him, moving with the careful precision of someone nursing recent injuries. His confrontation with Harrington had left him with bruised ribs and a renewed awareness of his age, reminders that even legendary operators eventually face the limitations of human physiology. "How are they?" Sullivan asked, nodding toward Reed and Miller. "Physically recovering," Blackwood replied. "The medical team says the neural interfaces sustained damage but remain functional. Beyond that," he hesitated, searching for words to describe what he had observed. "They're different, Robert. Not just trained differently, fundamentally altered in ways I'm still trying to comprehend." Sullivan nodded, understanding implicit in his expression. That was the core of Olympus, not just enhancing existing capabilities but creating new ones, expanding what it means to be a human operator. "At what cost?" Blackwood asked the question that had haunted him since learning of the program. "You've seen the medical data. What happens to them long-term?" Sullivan's expression grew somber. "The projections vary. Best case, they adapt. The human brain is remarkably plastic, capable of integrating even the most invasive modifications given sufficient time. Worst case," he left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning was clear. They stood in silence, watching as Reed completed her examination and began dressing in the civilian clothes provided. Her movements retained the fluid precision that characterized Olympus graduates, but Blackwood noticed subtle differences, microscopic hesitations, fractional delays that would be imperceptible to anyone who hadn't observed her at peak performance. "Kirkpatrick is still out there," Blackwood said finally. "Harrington's in custody, but the architect of all this remains free." "Not for long," Sullivan replied with quiet confidence. "The evidence Reed and Miller brought back, combined with what I'd already gathered, it's enough for formal charges. The Justice Department has frozen Helios's assets pending investigation. Kirkpatrick's passport has been flagged. It's only a matter of time. Unless he has other contingencies we haven't anticipated," Blackwood countered. "A man who orchestrated something like Olympus, who planned the elimination of his own creations, he won't surrender easily." Sullivan acknowledged this with a slight nod. which is why we're keeping Reed and Miller under protection until he's apprehended. They're the primary targets, the living evidence of what Olympus really was. The door to the observation area opened, admitting Reed. She had changed into standard civilian attire, but nothing could disguise the extraordinary capabilities that now defined her. She carried herself with the poised awareness that came from years of specialized training, enhanced by technologies most people couldn't begin to comprehend. The medical team cleared me for limited duty. She reported, her tone professional, despite the circumstances. The interface is stable, though some advanced functions remain offline pending further evaluation. Sullivan studied her with the careful assessment of a commander responsible for his personnel's welfare. And beyond the technical metrics, how are you, Alexis? The question, personal rather than professional, seemed to catch Reed momentarily off guard. For an instant, the carefully constructed facade of the Olympus operative gave way to something more fundamentally human. Uncertainty, vulnerability, perhaps even fear. I'm processing, she admitted, the simple acknowledgement revealing more than any detailed explanation could have. The program is exposed, our cover identities compromised. Everything we were trained for, everything we became, it's all in flux now. Not everything, Blackwood interjected. Your service, your sacrifice, those remain constant, regardless of the program's status. Reed glanced at him, something like gratitude flickering in her expression. Thank you, Colonel, but the reality remains we're walking classified programs. The technologies integrated into our bodies, the training encoded in our neural pathways, we're living embodiments of capabilities the government may no longer want acknowledged. The assessment was brutally accurate. With Olympus exposed and its ethical implications under scrutiny, the graduates represented a complicated legacy. Heroes who had served their country through a program that violated fundamental principles of medical ethics and human dignity. Which brings us to the question of your future, Sullivan said, addressing the issue directly. The Secretary of Defense has authorized a special protocol for the remaining Olympus graduates. You'll be offered choices, something the program never provided. What kind of choices? Reed asked, wariness evident in her tone. Retirement with full benefits and lifetime medical support. Transition to specialized instructor roles, training conventional forces in adapted versions of your techniques. Or, Sullivan hesitated, then continued, a new operational unit, limited deployment, complete transparency, ethical oversight, using your capabilities not as weapons, but as tools for the most critical national security challenges. Reed absorbed these options, her expression thoughtful. And the interfaces, the enhancements. Maintained but not upgraded, Sullivan replied honestly. The medical team believes they can be sustained indefinitely with proper support. Removal would be complicated with uncertain outcomes. The unspoken reality hung in the air between them. The Olympus graduates would always be different, their bodies and minds permanently altered by technologies that could neither be fully integrated nor safely removed. They would exist in a liminal space between conventional humanity and something else, pioneers who had crossed a frontier few would follow. Before Reed could respond, the door opened again. Jason Miller entered, his expression betraying tension despite his controlled movements. Kirkpatrick, he said without preamble. He's gone. Satellite surveillance lost him in Singapore 3 hours ago. He boarded a private aircraft with diplomatic clearance from an unidentified Asian government. Sullivan's expression hardened. Which government? Analysis suggests China or North Korea, Miller replied. Either way, he's beyond our immediate reach. The implications were clear and disturbing. Kirkpatrick hadn't just fled justice, he had defected, taking with him the complete knowledge of Olympus technologies and their implementation. Knowledge that in the wrong hands could lead to the creation of enhanced operators serving interests opposed to American security. So it's not over, Blackwood said, stating what had become painfully obvious. This is just the beginning of a new phase. Reed and Miller exchanged glances, a silent communication born of shared experience and enhanced perception. Then Reed turned to Sullivan, her decision evident in her posture before she spoke. The operational unit, she said firmly. Miller and I both. If Kirkpatrick is developing these technologies for foreign powers, you need operators who understand what they're facing, who know the capabilities and limitations firsthand. Sullivan nodded, having anticipated this response. It won't be official. No medals, no public recognition. The secretary was clear about that. We're used to operating in the shadows, Miller replied, a hint of grim humor in his tone. It's what we were built for. The decision marked a turning point, not just for Reed and Miller personally, but for the classified world of enhanced human performance in military applications. With Olympus exposed with its ethical boundaries violated and its technologies potentially proliferating to hostile powers, the rules had changed irrevocably. "What about you, Colonel?" Reed asked, turning to Blackwood. "Where do you fit in this new paradigm?" Blackwood had been pondering this question since their return to Washington. His career had followed a conventional trajectory: decorated combat officer, respected commander, potential general. But his experiences with Reed and Miller had opened his eyes to capabilities beyond conventional warfare and to ethical questions that would define military operations for decades to come. "I've been offered command of the Oversight Committee," he replied, "ensuring that whatever comes next adheres to ethical guidelines and legal boundaries, making sure no future Olympus operates without proper constraints." Reed nodded approval, evident in her expression. "They chose well. You've seen both sides now, the capabilities and the costs. And you trust me to make those judgments?" Blackwood asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. "I trust you to remember that we're still human," Reed replied simply. "Despite everything that was done to us, despite the enhancements and modifications underneath it all, we remain human beings who chose to serve. That perspective will be crucial in whatever comes next." The statement, straightforward yet profound, crystallized what Blackwood had observed throughout their ordeal. Beneath the neural interfaces and enhanced capabilities beyond the classified protocols and operational parameters, Reed and Miller had demonstrated the qualities that defined the best of military service: courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to protecting others. As they prepared to depart for their respective assignments, Sullivan gestured Blackwood aside for a final private word. "What you've witnessed changes everything, James," the general said quietly. "The line between human and machine, between natural capability and technological enhancement, it's no longer theoretical. It's operational reality." Blackwood nodded, understanding the weight of this observation. "And our job is to ensure that reality serves humanity, not the other way around." "Exactly," Sullivan confirmed, "because the genie is out of the bottle now. Kirkpatrick's defection ensures that enhanced operators will become part of the global security landscape. Our task is to navigate that landscape without losing sight of what makes military service honorable in the first place: the human beings who choose to stand between danger and those they've sworn to protect." As they rejoined Reed and Miller for final briefings, Blackwood reflected on the journey that had brought him here from the routine operations of his Black Dagger unit to the classified world of Project Olympus, from conventional warfare to the frontiers of human enhancement. The path ahead would challenge everything he thought he knew about military capability and ethical boundaries. But looking at Reed, the quiet lieutenant, whose extraordinary capabilities had been revealed through adversity, Blackwood found renewed purpose. Whatever came next, whatever challenges emerged from the shadow of Project Olympus, the fundamental values of service remained constant: honor, duty, sacrifice, the quiet strength of those who stood between their nation and harm, regardless of the personal cost. In a world of changing technologies and evolving threats, these principles remain the silent torch that illuminated the path forward, a beacon of human integrity in an increasingly complex future.